So, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Helen Christians, and I'll be your MC this morning. Uh, you are at the Humanists of Greater Portland Sunday morning meeting, and I want to welcome those folks who are joining us through Zoom and those attending in person at Friendly House. The Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association, and humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching primary importance to human experiences rather than supernatural beliefs. Humanists value the worth and goodness of all human beings and seek to find common values and respect among people. Humanists stay curious and open as they seek rational ways to solve problems by listening to others and speaking their own truth to find equitable solutions through science, reason, and free inquiry. Our topic at today's meeting, Ending the Pacific War, especially addresses the humanist commitment of critical thinking, ethical development, humility, and global awareness. Jules, thank you so much. I could tell how much you had prepared for this, and also want to thank your wife, who you will be celebrating. Did you say did I get the number right or wrong? How many years?
66.
I thought you said that. 66 years of marriage. And so what are you going to be performing for us now?
I'm going to end with some other klezmer.
Oh, some klezmer. Wonderful. Oh, Jules, thank you so much. That was beautiful. And Jules, that was really sweet that your willingness to do that for us. And thank you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. We're in for another real treat. We've got a lot of homegrown folks here today. I'd like now to introduce today's speaker. It's a really very special when one of our own members prepare a presentation for us. This is Robert Sanford's 24th presentation to HGP. He usually does presentations on either poetry or photography, but today he's presenting a program from a historical perspective. He is really a Renaissance man, this guy. I mean, it's just multifaceted. Robert has studied World War II since college, where he majored in history and has continued his research and real passion for the subject. He now serves as a minor editor to the World War II site on Wikipedia. Robert joined HGP in 1998, and he originated the MC position, which we continue to date, and served as the MC for HGP for 7 years. And actually, he taught me how to continue. So, Robert, real thank you for your service to HGP. Today he will be sharing the many different factors for the ending of World War II against Japan. Come on in, Robert. So looking forward to this presentation.
It's lovely to be invited to speak. Somebody who enjoys speaking as much as I do. It's especially lovely to be invited back. And this is a program on the bombing of Japan, how we got close enough to do it, why we did it the way we did to end the war. It's a controversial and complicated topic and conclusions. Parts may be uncomfortable for many of you. Bigger issues may cause discomfort too. There's a lot of information to share. As I said, a complicated topic with lots of background. And have some preliminary background, starting with the US overall approach to war. And that is, in 3 words, machines over people. US military was 25% of all Allied combatants. We supplied 75% of all Allied equipment. 40,000 trucks just to Russia. By May 1945, the gross domestic product of the Allies was 5 times that of Germany, Japan, and Italy. By June of 45, the Imperial Japanese Navy built 6 fleet carriers. Those are the big ones. We built 17. We were launching a fleet carrier every 2 months. By VJ Day, which is August 14th to 45, we had 122 escort carriers. Those are the little ones, only carried about 40 planes instead of the 90 on the fleet carriers. We had 122 of them. I mean, think of what that means. Part of the machines over people was the way we built things. The German Tiger tank, which is one of the most fearsome tanks in World War II, was built by hand. Mostly they broke down. They had a 6-speed Porsche transmission that hardly ever worked, and they built 489 of them. So less than 500. Now, if they're coming down on you and you're in a foxhole, that's a pretty fearsome tank unless it broke down. We built Sherman tanks. Took 1/6 of the hours to build the Shermans. We built 49,300 Sherman tanks versus 489 Tigers. In 1939, we built 3,000 airplanes. By the end of World War II, we'd built 300,000 airplanes. So we spent a lot of money in World War II, and the 3 most expensive single projects were: the most expensive, B-29, cost $750,000 each. The bomb cost $2 billion, and the Norden bomb sight cost $1.5 billion, which is about the cost of 4,000 B-17s. We built 13,000 B-17s, by the way. The Germans had the blueprints of the Norden bomb sight by 1938. And Norden went to school at the Zurich Polytechnic in the 20s, early 20s. And one of his classmates, Lenin. 3 great secrets during World War II on the Allied side. One is we were reading the codes. We were breaking the Enigma code the Germans were using, which is a fascinating story by itself. And we read JN-25, which is a Japanese naval code. Normandy was the next biggest secret. And of course, the third is the bomb. And we have some myths in America about World War II. And one of them is that the Americans and British Empire and the Russians were equal partners in the destruction of Germany. So here's a question for you to ponder for a second. For every 100 German soldiers killed in combat in World War II, how many were killed on the Eastern Front? 79. The 21% were killed Africa, Italy, France, Germany, by the US and Britain. Second myth is bombing accuracy. The young and eager 1920 US Army pilot officers, called the bomber mafia, 20 years ago were generals, and they were planning bombing strategy and shaping strategy. And even with all the bombings, 36,000 sorties over Europe in World War II, German war production increased until D-Day, June of 44. Then cumulative damage started to reduce their war production. In Japan, you could make a strong case that bombing precluded and obviated a need to invade. 49% of Royal Air Force bombs dropped between May of 40 and May of 41 fell in open country. Only 5% of the bombs hit the target. Now, the RAF definition of target within 5 miles. So if you were bombing the south end of the I-5 bridge and hit Friendly House, it was on target because it's 5 miles. The US defined the target as being within a 1,000-foot radius around the aiming point. But think about this. You're in a B-17, you're going 100 or 250 miles an hour, you're bouncing around, there's flak, which anti-aircraft fire. You got fighters, you got the wind, you've got a lot of other huge airplanes in a small space trying to avoid flak and fighters. 250 miles an hour is 4 miles a minute. Just learning how to fly in formation, which is what the B-17s had to do. 12,000 American aircrew died in training accidents, many when those planes ran into each other. But even though the bombing wasn't very effective, there were 65,000 German soldiers in anti-aircraft defense roles who were not on the front lines. That's 3 or 4 divisions. That's a lot. The third myth surrounds Dresden, which a lot of you read about. And this could be tough for many of you, because most of what people know about the bombing of Dresden comes from a work of fiction, people. Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, wonderful book. It claimed 135,000 killed. It was about 22 to 25,000. Big difference. The Slaughterhouse-Five claimed there weren't any significant military targets, and Vonnegut apologized later for misrepresentation. It was a major rail transport communication center. 110 factories and 50,000 workers were supporting the German war effort. The Soviets asked us to bomb Dresden because the rail yards were being used to remove German soldiers east to counter the Soviet armies moving west. So myth 1, 21% of casualties. Myth 2, bombing accuracy. Myth 3, Dresden. Myth 4, bombing impacted morale. Well, even if it did, our enemies were not democracies. They're not going to go to the polls and vote Hitler out of power, right? Everybody tracking down. And they're already being terrorized by their own government. And bombs never broke morale. It worked the other way. Increased resolve. Think of 9/11. And the fifth myth is a little myth, but it's interesting. There was an A ration card for gasoline, 4 gallons a week. And you know what? We had all the gasoline we would ever need. So why was there rationing? Rubber, because cars run on tires. And rationing gasoline was the way to lengthen the life of rubber. So I'm going to talk about the war in the Pacific. We've got 3 key battles for you. And this is a period from June of 44 to June of 45. June of 44 is D-Day and the fall of Rome in the West. Poor General Clark took Rome on June 4th and thought he was going to get all the headlines. And 2 days later, D-Day happened. So the first battle I want to share about is the Marianas, Saipan and Tinian and Guam, mid-June. So just after D-Day, just after the fall of Rome in 1944. 1,300 miles from the home islands, which is how I'm going to refer to Japan. 2 major United States Navy fleets. Fifth Fleet had 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, plus pickets, destroyers, destroyer escorts, over 900 airplanes, 130,000 troops, mostly Marines, some Army. U.S. 10th Army was in the Pacific. The Third Fleet had exactly the same number of boats or ships, submarines, everything. You know why that is? It's the same fleet. When Halsey was in charge of it, it was the Fifth Fleet. When Spruance was in charge of it, it was the Third Fleet. And they did it that way because the fleets at sea, they bring Spruance and his command team to the fleet, and Halsey gets taken back to Pearl, and Halsey and his command staff plan the next operation for the fleet, which when he gets it again will be renumbered. And it confused anybody trying to break the code. After the Battle of Marianas, constructed 6 airfields on Tinian for the B-29s. It's a 15-hour mission to bomb Japan. It's also an advanced submarine base. 20,000 Allied casualties, 90,000 Imperial Japanese Army and civilian deaths. Okay. Second battle I want to share details of is Iwo Jima. So we've moved from June of 44 to February of 45. Iwo Jima is 750 miles from Japan, and it's on a direct line from the Marianas, which is why it had strategic value. Projected the battle would last 9 days. It lasted 5 weeks. 6,200 Marine dead, 20,000 wounded. Also some Army and Navy losses for 8 square miles. So here's what 8 square miles is. You go to I-5 in Killingsworth. Okay, got that in your head? Go east to 82nd. That's 4 miles. You go south to Gleason. That's 2 miles. You come back west on Gleason to I-5 and go north to Killingsworth. That's 8 miles, 8 square miles. It's the closest we've been to Hawaii yet on the ground. 27 medals of honor to the Marines on Iwo Jima, just 28% of all the World War II Marine medals of honor. But the result was we had an emergency bomber field. So the planes coming back from Tokyo that were damaged or having a problem, they could land there. Plus it's a fighter base fighter base for escorting the bombers. So the bombers take off from Tinian and they fly over Iwo Jima, and a couple hours later, the fighters pick them up because fighters are faster than bombers and they don't have the range. So they're with the bombers over the target. Iwo Jima is the most concentrated US Navy bombardment of the war. The result is by VJ Day, which is August of 45, 2,200 B-29s landed there rather than ditched. That's 24,000 crew members. And the first B-29 emergency landing was D-Day, Iwo Jima D-Day plus 13. So March 4th, already landed B-29s on Iwo Jima. The last Imperial Japanese Army soldiers on Iwo Jima, which was February 45, surrendered January of 49. So 1 month short of 4 years. So here's a strategy question about the arithmetic of war. It's a tough question. Would you trade 7,000 Marines, sailors, and soldiers for 24,000 aircrew? Because that's the equation. And the answer is, of course you would. Machines over people, though. Everybody tracking that? Our own Jerry Gage was on Iwo Jima, had its 19th birthday on day 5. He was in the 13th Battalion of the 5th Marines. The death and injury rate of U.S. military ground troops in the Pacific was 3.5 times higher than in Europe, just across the board. And there was a Marine company that landed on Iwo on February 19th, 332 Marines. 2 weeks later, there were 12 left. Now, they weren't all killed. They were wounded and evacuated, but they had 12 left from that original company at 332. So that's the Marianas, that's Iwo Jima, and the third battle is Okinawa, which is also an emergency base, emergency field for B-29s. And it's way over on the west between Formosa and Hawaii, and the home islands. D-Day was April 1st, which was also Easter. And it was an 83-day battle. 12 days after the Okinawa invasion on April 1st, Franklin Roosevelt died. And it was a year after the Marianas, and it was 2 months after Iwo Jima. It was a base for the home island invasion. Iwo's too small. It's 8 square miles. You can't launch 500,000-600,000 troops from an 8 square mile island. Okinawa is 460 square miles, twice the size of Chicago, just to give you a picture. Okinawa is the bloodiest Pacific theater of operations battle. It was populated. There were people living there. There weren't people living on Okinawa. It's the largest fleet in history, 1,320 ships, had 11 fleet carriers, 28 others, 20 battleships, 38 cruisers. This is 15% of all the U.S. naval casualties in World War II. It's the deadliest U.S. naval battle ever. 20,000 Allied dead, 77,000 Japanese Army dead, 150,000 civilians died, and it's half the population. It was the first large-scale use of kamikazes. There were 350 kamikaze attacks the first 2 days, 1,500 total. 3,500 were shot down. They hit 200 Allied vessels, 4,900 killed, 4,900 wounded, almost all sailors, 24 medals of honor. So the result was we built runways, fighter escorts for B-29s, and emergency landing for B-29s. Fierce resistance and casualty counts cause new concerns about invading the home islands. I mean, does that make sense to everybody? Many think the losses here pushed the US to use the bomb. So the bombing of Japan from mostly the Marianas, we started bombing the home islands in October of 44 and discovered something nobody knew anything about. B-29s were cruising over Japan at 30,000 feet, 220 miles an hour, and all of a sudden they're doing 375. Jet stream. That's how we learned it existed. At 375 miles an hour, you're going over 6 miles a minute. So think about bombing accuracy. That's a mile every about 9 seconds. And accuracy, you're at 30,000 feet up with a 200-mile wind below you. Be lucky if you hit Japan, right? So Curtis LeMay was brought in from India to run the 21st Air Force, and he made these changes. He went from high altitude, 30,000 feet bombing to 5,000 feet. Took out all the guns and the ammunition for the guns for the on board the airplanes. The planes didn't have to go to 30,000 feet, so they didn't need as much gasoline, and they could carry more ordnance. It's harder to hit the bombers because they're not very high and they are really moving relative to their moving at 30,000 feet, easier to hit the targets. Bombing accuracy wasn't much of an issue by then. And there was no fighter defense to worry about because the Japanese had stopped trying to intercept the B-29s because they're saving the planes for the invasion. There were a few huge factories left, but 40% or so of all the work done was done in workers' homes, little lathes and drill presses and welding outfits. And they'd take these sub-assemblies into the factory when they went to work in the morning and plug them in on the assembly line. I'm guessing they had assembly lines, but I don't know. The Germans didn't. So some of the home island bombing strategy is based on good reasons and some on excuses. The island defense strategy is the reverse of Allied policy. The Japanese basic philosophy is spirit over machines. And they're going to oppose the US bravery versus firepower, character and culture versus machines. Complete opposite. Everybody tracking that? Here's a little cultural window for you into Japan. When passing the Imperial Palace in a streetcar, okay, high walls, you couldn't see any of the buildings. The Japanese would stand, face the palace, and bow. And there's a principle, damashii, Japanese fighting spirit must be able to defeat quantity. Involves civilians. 28 million Japanese civilians been given weapons after the Okinawa success and a little training, mostly sharpened bamboo stakes. High school girls got an 18-inch crochet hook they were supposed to jab in some Marine or soldier's stomach. Younger children, so middle school now we're talking about, were given contact mines to run up and stick on a tank. So guess when the contact mine blows up? We had some 12-year-olds standing there. Okay. And they were pretty racist too, just like us. Pure Asians versus decadent Americans, spirit versus steel. The kamikaze strategy allowed the use of untrained pilots and obsolete planes. And since there was no return trip, the gasoline reserves more efficiently used. Japan was manufacturing 1,500 new planes a month. They didn't have to be great planes. I mean, they didn't have to last more than a couple hours in the air, right? There were 2 or 3 million Japanese army soldiers in Japan on the home islands. They could add 21,000 a month. 2 million troops in Korea, Manchuria, China, Taiwan, plus 5,000 army fighter planes, plus 5,000 kamikaze planes. 7,400 aircraft were available for the November 45 invasion, 7,400 to stop that invasion, and 5,000 more for the second invasion, which was February 46. They planned on 300 to 400 kamikazes an hour onto the first invasion. And it could be even higher casualty rates because this was the home islands, not just some remote island or a province. And here's what the goal was. Higher American casualty rates could well lead public opinion to end the war and give Japan some of the 5 conditions they were asking for. Keep the emperor. They wanted to disarm themselves. They wanted no occupation. They only wanted Japanese to conduct war crime trials, and they wanted to keep all their captured territories. Perfectly reasonable, right? So remember the Allies' strategy, machines over people. Island hopping, everybody understand what that means? We didn't invade all the islands. We just left some of the troops there ignored. It meant sinking their merchant marine. They had to import 95% of the petroleum they used, and we sank 85% of their merchant marine. 2% of our fleet was submarines, and they had about 60% of the merchant marine sinkings, right? And the aircraft carriers were the emerging power in the war. Everybody got that figured out. So at the end of World War II, when the Navy admirals went to Congress and wanted money to replace ships, well, what kind of ships did they want? Submarines? Aircraft carriers? Battleships. The Allied strategy, machines over people, includes firepower. The superior quality and numbers of weapons gave each U.S. division, that's 12 to 15,000 soldiers or Marines, 5 or 6 times the firepower of a Japanese division. That meant bombing the cities, because that's where the war industries and the war workers were. The most damaging raid was Tokyo, March of 45, and 100,000 died, many more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And they hardly hit the big Mitsubishi factory. But half the employees stopped going to work. Target precision had somewhat ceased to exist as a planning factor. We know about prisoner of war crimes starting in January 45 because we liberated the Philippines and there were big prisoner of war compounds on Luzon. We had seen the Japanese behavior toward conquered people. Bataan Death March, the rape of Nanking, 200,000 murders and 20,000 cases of rape. Comfort women, 50 to 200,000 Korean women drafted as prostitutes for the Japanese army in occupied areas. The liberation of Manila, at the end of the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, 100,000 plus Filipino civilians were just murdered during the battle. And all that pretty much limited charitable thoughts toward Japanese cities. So why atomic bombings? Why not just continue with what we were doing? And several reasons are better than one. And I have several. One is to shorten the war, minimize further destruction, legitimate as any other weapon, extreme extension of machines over people. Secondly, prevent 2 invasions. 3, stiff arm the Russians. We wanted them out of East Asia and out of East Asia politics. Stalin wanted to be part of the peace talks, wanted Japanese territory for an August 8th invasion of Manchuria, and wanted a role in occupying Japan. And I get some more information on that coming up. And to validate the cost, $2 billion, remember? Harry Truman was a senator before he was nominated as vice president. And he was in charge of there was a committee of senators called the Truman Committee, probably some representatives on it too, to investigate war waste and profit and all that kind of good stuff, go Harry. And Harry finally found this budget line item that said Manhattan Project, which was making the bomb. There were 3 factories around the US, and then they put it together and built it and designed it at Los Alamos, New Mexico. And so the vice president, or maybe a secretary of war, I can't remember which, kind of took Harry aside and put his arm around her and said, Harry, don't go there. Because Truman did not know about the project. FDR's vice president, Henry Wallace, didn't know about the project. So it was Roosevelt, General Groves, and the scientists. The people working at Hanford and Oak Ridge, and I can't remember the third place, didn't know what they were doing. They were just told to do this. And so they just kept doing this. And they handed it on and somebody else did something. Clueless about what was going on. And that's okay. One of the quotes out of Los Alamos, by the way, you'll love. It might have been Oppenheimer, but I can't track it down. The comment was, if this project succeeds, there won't be an investigation. If this project doesn't succeed, they won't investigate anything else. So here's the cost of an invasion. We had almost 700,000 troops committed to the first invasion. We expected 500,000 American casualties, maybe 10 million Japanese casualties. There was a colonel who was one of the head people working out what the projection casualty rates might be. It was Dean Rusk, John Kennedy's Secretary of State. We expected to use as much munitions, so bombs, bullets, artillery shells, all that kind of stuff, as we did in North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific up to November 1st, just to support the invasion. Total US battle deaths in World War II were 407,000. From the 11 months from D-Day to VE Day, so June of 44, May of 45, 66% of those combat deaths in the last 11 months of the ground war. The home invasion could double that. Although these guesstimates are pretty fluid, as you might imagine. Other concerns. 250,000 more Asian civilians were killed every month in Japanese occupied territory. Like the rape of Nanking, like the civilians in Manila killed as the Japanese left the island. How many more months could we wait for Japan to surrender? There were 100,000 Allied POWs in Japan. What would their reaction be to an invasion? And there's some revenge. Sneak attack, Pearl Harbor, racism. I'm reading a book about the 442nd Regimental Combat Team which earned more Purple Hearts than any other unit in the American Army in World War II. They were all Japanese. Yeah. And it took them a while to get in the Army and to be given weapons. So a lot of people think, why didn't we give an atomic bomb demo? Well, it might not work. We'd never tested the Hiroshima bomb design. We only tested the Nagasaki design. That was the plutonium bomb. That was July 16th of 45. We never tested the uranium bomb design. And we only had 3 bombs left after the test in New Mexico. If the test was in or near Japan, which makes sense because they want to demonstrate it to the Japanese, and it was a dud, they'd have all the bomb parts. And would lessen the shock value. So there's only 2 real options to end the war. Bombing, continued bombing, various kinds, and an invasion. There's a whole group of historians that admit that the atomic bombings ended the war virtually, but not exactly immediately, and that millions of Japanese lives were spared. And those historians are all Japanese. Bombs were terrible weapons, but not to use them would have been more terrible. Can you imagine Harry Truman with, let's say, 240,000 casualties in the first invasion, November of 45, trying to tell the mothers and daughters, sisters, wives of those men killed that he had a bomb and didn't use it? And there's $2 billion sitting in a shed on Tinian. I had a lot of great teachers. And one of them was my 8th grade block teacher, John Doyle. And he was brilliant. And one of the things I still remember, I'm 12 years old, people, maybe 13 by the end of the year. There's causes and there's sparks. And he was talking about World War I. The causes were nationalism, militarism, secret alliances, and conflicting alliances, right? It was a mess, but it wasn't enough to start a war. Then there was an assassination in Sarajevo. Gavrilo Princip killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and a month later, that's the spark. Civil War had lots of causes. Slavery, cultural and economic differences, been going on for decades. Then there was a spark called Fort Sumter. World War II, our spark was Pearl Harbor. And the same here as for the end, at the end of the war. The Japanese cities were burning. There was a shipping embargo. They lost almost all their conquered territory outside China. They were getting desperate. They were down to about 1,600 calories a day. And that's all causes. There's no spark. They knew they'd lost the war, but refused to surrender. As losing and surrendering, especially in Japan, are 2 completely different things, not necessarily connected by logic. There's this cultural values in the middle. So there were 3 sparks. The 2 bombs and something we don't know much about, the Russian invasion, and I've got some information. Russia invaded Japan. And it's hard to separately quantify the 3 sparks other than their cumulative effect. Nobody really knows which had what percentage. There's lots of opinions, but opinions are like belly buttons, everybody has one. So here's some chronology here. This is mid-July to mid-August. Potsdam is the conference of Churchill / Clement Attlee, Truman, and Stalin in the suburbs of Berlin, July or to early August of 45. So these are the winners meeting in Germany to figure out the occupation and other stuff, and then deal with Japan. And we sent a message to Japan. So we had a connection through the Swiss embassy. The following are our terms. We will not deviate from them. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay. And 1, elimination of the war leaders, including the emperor. 2, occupation. 3, retain only the home islands. 4, Japanese military forces completely disarmed, and stern justice for all war criminals. And how did the Japanese respond to that? They didn't. The Japanese term is mokusatsu. It means treat with silent contempt. So they sat on it. During the Potsdam Conference, as I said, there was a test of the Nagasaki bomb in the New Mexico desert. Russia had pledged to invade Japan 3 months after VE Day, which was May 8th. So August 8th, they were supposed to put boots on the ground. And it's actually really August 15th, but it was 3 months and a little after VE Day. And then they kept moving the date earlier, a couple days at a time. So we kept moving the bombing dates earlier, a couple of days at a time, now that we know at least one of those bombs worked. There's some other issues. The terrain of the home islands favored defense. Now, normally, if Army A is attacking a defended coastline that Army B is holding, you get to equal when Army A is 3 times bigger than Army B. And difficult to invade terrain makes those numbers worse for the invader. The Japanese had guessed the 2 landing beaches because they only had 2 that were reasonable. One in the north, which we were going to use in November, and one in the south we were going to use in February. They figured it out. And we were beginning to rethink the invasion because our code reading reports detailed defensive buildup at the beaches. Plus, we knew about the Okinawa casualties. Okay, everybody track. This is a lot of information, but so the Trinity, which was the bomb test in New Mexico, by the way, you can go to rock shops around the Southwest and get stuff called trinitite, which is the fused sand, right? Or sand from after the explosion. I got some, gave to my grandson. So Trinity changed Truman's attitude about the Soviet entry into the Pacific War. On July 25th, Truman approves the use of bombs, Hiroshima, Kakura, Niigata, Nagasaki, in that order. Kyoto was originally on the target list. Here's a little crapshoot of history. But Secretary of State James Burns has spent his honeymoon there in the 20s and took it off the target list. Yeah, travel agent change. Truman now sought to delay or prevent Russia's entry. By August 1st, the Japanese had moved 1 million more troops to the home islands. August 6th, Joyce's birthday, by the way, yesterday, Joyce Lackey's birthday. We bombed Hiroshima. There's Army headquarters there, a lot of material storage and assembly. Total of about 400,000 Japanese Army personnel were stationed in the city. 2 days later, they had the council for the prosecution of the war, which was about what the formal council was. The emperor sat, didn't say anything. They had 4 people connected to the military and 2 people who were civilians. Okay, so guess which way the votes usually went. They refused to consider. War Minister Anami said they only have 1 bomb. There were a lot of new messages between headquarters and field commands. And the concern was, because we couldn't read them all in real time, that it was about killing the POWs. There was no meeting of the war committee on the 8th. This is now 2 days after Hiroshima, because they didn't have a quorum. I mean, they have a picnic, somebody's kid sick, home from school, but they didn't even have a meeting. So we continue normal bombing. Togo, who was the prime minister, don't confuse him with Tojo, who was the main Japanese villain. He was the army commander. So Togo is the prime minister, civilian, one of the 2 civilians on this committee. And the emperor agree that the war is lost, we must surrender. And they met on August 9th. They're defeated, but they're not ready to surrender. Remember, those are 2 different things. Military still dug in. We've lost, but there's no surrender without conditions, and they go back to the same 5 conditions. The emperor says ending the war is desirable. And then the news came, the Russia invasion of Manchuria. They crossed the border with 1 million troops, 3,700 tanks, and lots of artillery. And then the news came in about Nagasaki, one of the largest seaports in southern Japan, a lot of industrial activity, production of ordnance, ships, military equipment, other war materials. There were 2 Mitsubishi shipyards, steel mills, arms plants. 90% of the population worked on war work. We were going to wait 2 more days till the 10th, but the weather was deteriorating, and we wanted to hint we had lots of bombs. Well, we did. We had 1. Bombing destroyed about 20% of housing from March of 45 to August of 45, made 15 million Japanese homeless. The emperor says, accept the Potsdam Declaration, which is our 5, include the emperor. So we were, one of our demands, it came out of Roosevelt's casual comment at Casablanca conference, unconditional surrender. Well, the Germans said, well, we must fight on till the end then, because it's unconditional surrender. If they had had a conditional surrender, the war in Europe could have ended earlier. So they were kind of stuck. The military, this is after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Russian invasion, said, accept the Potsdam Declaration, but with these 4 conditions. And it's the same old 4. Not the emperor. That's getting to be a soft position. But it's really hard to admit that, because we thought the emperor was like Hitler, and it was really Tojo who was like Hitler. Does that make sense? He was the chief villain. They spoke for hours. Couldn't come to a conclusion. This is after all 3 sparks. Then they had a full cabinet meeting, spoke for more hours. Togo accept the Potsdam Declaration. He was ignored. On the 10th at 2:00 in the morning, Togo and the other civilian agreed to Potsdam except keep the emperor. And they said, ask the emperor, because he rarely indicated, he just got there as this magisterial presence. And the emperor said, accept. We're good. So Truman got a message from Japan, essentially, didn't say this in so many words, and there's some of that coming. We're going to trade the emperor for ending the war quickly. We keep the emperor. You got it. Okay. Except our acceptance message never said, yes, you can keep the emperor. But it did say, we're going to need the emperor to help us during the occupation, which subtle, but a big difference. Everybody tracking that? On 8/13, so now it's 5 days after Nagasaki, during a high-level meeting, one of the admirals came in and said that sacrificing 20 million Japanese lives in kamikaze attacks would win the war. And you wonder how, but that was a military position. So there was a regular raid on the 14th. The Japanese accepted Potsdam plus the emperor. They made a radio broadcasting on 278 RPM records. There were mutinies in the general staff, people killing, people who were supporting the surrender. Truman was ready to order a third bombing. And on August 15th, Hirohito said, we're done. And played this. They'd hardly ever seen him. They'd certainly never heard his voice. So they're all tuned in on their radios. He never said surrender. I think a lot of people know this. He said, we must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. A lot of Japanese suicides, high level on the Japanese side the next couple of days. Over 100 American prisoners of war were murdered. Australian, British prisoners of war were murdered in Borneo. We signed a treaty on September 2nd, Tokyo Bay on the USS Missouri, Truman's home state. Little politics there. MacArthur did not sign for the US. Anybody know that? Nimitz signed for the US. MacArthur signed for all the Allies. 3 days later, the Russians stopped moving, stopped further invasions. And essentially, we were going to use the bomb, no demonstrations, no observers on some distant island. It may be a crime against humanity, but it's also the punishment of a crime. Ted Koppel said the bomb was a tragedy. Not to use it would have been a greater tragedy. And the 1996 Gallup poll, 25% of Americans surveyed did not know we dropped atomic bombs on Japan. Okay, it's question time. Any questions from here?
Let's see, Robert, that was wonderful. That you had my you had my full attention. It was just amazing. I loved it. Having grown up when I did, being born a little bit after World War II ended, and a dad who had fought in the European front, I found it just fascinating. And my uncle served in the Pacific Front, and two uncles actually served in the Pacific Front. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Anyway, so here's our first question from Leslie. We could have arranged a diplomatic truce for a demonstration of the bomb within the territory. It was never considered or continued. If a demonstration tactic was even early considered, we could have made backup bombs. The demonstration would have stopped the Russians. Any thought about that, Robert or Doyne? Did you get that?
Well, it was one of the most closely held secrets of the war almost until we used it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's not enough time in there to arrange all that. Plus, as I said, we only had 3 more bombs and we were going to use 2 of them. And then we were going to use a third one.
Right.
So, and where would you do it? If you did it on some Pacific island, the blast would just go out across the water and it would miss all the effect of in the city. You couldn't really tell what a big deal it was except for the cloud going up.
Okay, thank you. Dave, we have a question.
Robert, I think you made it pretty clear that the bombing, especially the nuclear bombs, saved many lives because we didn't have to do an in-person invasion. But I've been wondering for years and years about the nuclear bombs, this question, partly because I've been following an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists that was started not long after the war to try to prevent large-scale nuclear bombing in warfare. So I've been wondering, what would have happened? I mean, was there an option to just drop the first nuclear bomb and then make it clear to the Japanese that we had more bombs and we're going to drop a second? I know you sort of alluded to that, but I'm not really clear. Was it absolutely necessary to drop the second nuclear bomb?
Well, it was almost 10 days after Hiroshima that they agreed to surrender, and they didn't agree after Hiroshima. I don't think we were going to tell them how few bombs we had, but Truman, there's a phrase he used, and I don't have it to quote, but rained devastation from the sky until they surrendered. And it took 2 bombs in the Russian invasion, because they weren't being, I think, practical or logical. They were being cultural about it.
Hi, thanks, Robert, for a great presentation. As I've mentioned to you before, I was a failed history major in college, but I did find out what good history majors would be able to do, and I can see that you succeeded. When I watched Robert McNamara's The Fog of War, I understood from that film that there were 27 fire bombings of Japanese cities prior to the use of the atomic weapons. And all of those fire bombings were not successful at ending the war. Is that your understanding, that Dresden gets a lot of focus for firebombing cities, but it happened many times in Japan?
There were about 60 cities that were firebombed using LeMay's incendiaries. One of the things about Dresden was it was very windy, and the bombing and the wind created what's called a firestorm, which only happened twice in the war. But the fires driving heat up, and the wind is bringing the wind in from out into the chimney of flame, and that just kept going for a couple days. And the same thing happened in Hanover, but that was never deliberate. It just happened. But we certainly deliberately firebombed about 60 Japanese cities.
Okay, Wayne from Friendly House, you had a question.
Well, I got two. One of them's real quick. What does D stand for in D-Day?
Nobody seems to know. It just emerged, and then it became useful as a word to put on the calendar. And now it's only used for the Normandy invasion, but every invasion had maybe it was Decision Day, maybe had something, I don't know. Nobody seems to know. Deployment,
Okay, and the second part is, if we do an atomic bomb and we kill a bunch of people and we stop the war, but that doesn't make any pain for the United States. So we'll just keep doing it. If we had all the pain and lost 500,000 people or 1 million troops, we would feel the pain in the United States, and we may not want to go to war as often as we do. Is that right?
Well, that makes logical sense. Yeah. I mean, we've never been, only New Mexico has had an atomic bomb go off in it.
There's a comment from, hang on 2 seconds, let's see. A comment, kind of reply comment back from Leslie. Rather than I think they're referring to demonstrate the use of the bomb on our own territory. It was a comment that was made. Not sure. Yeah.
Ideally, we'd get a bunch of Japanese high government officials to watch it, because they probably wouldn't believe a film.
That's true.
And it would be pretty awkward to land a C-47 at Tokyo Airport and put a bunch of Japanese government officials on it and haul them off somewhere and let them watch a bomb blow up.
It wasn't going to happen. Yeah. Renge has a lovely comment. He just wanted to express a great presentation. And how did you collate so much data? Hang on, guys, it keeps moving here. How did you collate so much data and present it so clearly and succinctly? He just wants to thank you, but I think he also wants to know, how'd you put this wonderful presentation together?
Well, I reread 2 or 3 books. I went through a lot of stuff that I know and knew and just threw it on pages and pages and pages, and then started sequencing it and organizing it. And then I kept taking material out. This is 27 pages, I think, and I started off, no, 23 pages, and I started off with almost 40.
Yeah. So, and you
So
got it
almost
down.
as much got eliminated as lived.
Yeah. Thank you, Robert. Yeah, that was hours of work, and we really appreciate it. And it's been recorded. Dave DiNucci has a question from Friendly House.
It seems to me it was a big question mark as to what the effect of this bomb on humans was going to be. I mean, how extreme. And if it had been 10 times as bad as it was, and it wiped out 10 times as many people, would it still have been a good idea? If it had been, I can imagine if it had been smaller, it might have still been a good idea. So were we just lucky that it was the right size, that it was the right thing to do? Or, I mean, how does that factor in?
One of the things that surprised the Americans was radiation. And the radiation probably ended as many lives sooner than were killed by the blast or the heat. But if it had been larger, maybe it wouldn't have taken 2 and the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
And that's really, I know, I mean, between us, you're the PhD, that it's really hard to quantify some of that. It was the equivalent of about 20 or 18,000 tons of TNT, and the Nagasaki bomb, I think, which was a plutonium bomb, not a uranium bomb, was about 12,000 tons.
Thank you, Robert. Al Christians has a question. Come on now.
Robert, how did the estimate of Allied casualties in the case of invasion get to be so low? The statistics that I'd read from naval intelligence were that the number of American casualties in the invasions of the various Pacific islands that would be killed plus wounded equals the number of Japanese defenders. And you've got 2 million defenders of the home islands. How can the expected number of casualties be so low as you told that?
Well,
were
we
the
had a
generals over optimistic like everybody?
We had an armada, 1,700 ships for the invasion in northern Japan on November 1st, and certainly not all of them had guns. A lot of them were cargo, a lot of them were, LST, landing troops, et cetera, but there were enough big guns and 900 airplanes worth of bombs, and I think about 800 B-29s on Tinian, and there would have been a lot of machines over people before we hit the beach. And I think that's the explanation.
Thank you. Renge has a question. Was there an attempt by a small group of palace forces to prevent the broadcast of the emperor to defeat? Can you elaborate on that? Was there an attempt that the emperor would not surrender.
Yeah, 40 or 50 medium to high ranking Japanese army people uh, tried to attack whoever had the record and get the 278s and break them. And they killed a lot of people, but they couldn't find where the records were. And then they were broadcast the next day. So there was a strong, I don't know to call it minority or not, but there was a strong element in the palace military and the committees that I've talked about to stop that broadcast being made.
Wow, fascinating.
And a lot of them then committed ritual seppuku.
Suzanne has a question. I've always thought that there was extreme cruelty for the POWs under the Japanese control. Is that true or just an exaggeration?
No, it's pretty true. Not only POWs, but civilians. You could look up the rape of Nanjing.
Mhm.
You know, there are stories about 2 Japanese officers having a race to see how many Chinese civilians they could behead with their swords in an hour. And one of them won, I think, 102 to 99. They lined them up and decapitated them as a little competition. Now that's extreme, but that's pretty well known.
Thank you. Jeff has a question from Friendly House.
Thank you, Robert. Great presentation. And you were talking about the Russian invasion. So that was of Manchuria, but not the home island?
Right, Manchuria.
Mhm.
So northwest China, northeast China, above Korea.
Leslie has a question. I'm curious just how much diplomacy with the Japanese was going on during the war.
Well, there's some minor contact to or between us and them through the Swiss embassy, but I'm not sure I'd call it diplomacy. They're just presenting positions and them either negating them or repeating their demands or mokusatsu, deliberate forgetting,
Deliberate
not
forgetting.
responding.
Not responding. Okay. And Hank Robb has a question. What made the Russians stop in Manchuria since there was really nothing to stop them?
Well, it was 5 days after the surrender, I think. It was 3 days after the surrender on the USS Missouri, and it was getting kind of pointless. And they weren't going to be given a seat at the table. They weren't going to be given captured territory, and they weren't going to be given part of the occupation overseeing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just sincerely thank you. And you'll hear applause from our audience at Friendly House and a heartfelt but probably silent applause from our Zoom participants. That was really well done and extremely interesting.